Gremlins? Welcome back to my channel and another episode of History with Miss Barney. Civil War Stories version. Hey, good job on your March to the Sea quiz yesterday. Just to review, last time I saw you, we were talking about how Sherman was trying to burn everything. But today, we are talking about Grant instead. So let's get going with that. Actually, before we start with that, I was going to tell you who our next bracket people are going to be. So our final bracket of the year is going to be like who was the most impressive or fascinating, I don't know, person we talked about this year. And you guys chose your top 5 and then I compiled them into a list of the top 8. So here they are. So according to you guys, the top 8 most impressive people we talked about this year were Jamestown colonist, Pocahontas, Salem witch trials girls. That one surprised me, I won't lie. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, and Kit Carson. So be thinking about who you think is the most impressive person we talked about this year. But how about we talk about the Civil War? That sounds good to me.
So, the topic of today's lesson is going to be when Grant and Lee finally face each other. So, remember, Grant was the general in the West who was just consistently winning, and he was like one of the only real fighters in the Union Army, where Lee was by far the best general that the Confederates had, who had had some stunning victories against the Union. So, for the first time, the A teams are finally going against each other in the war. So Lee was once again looking for a single victory that would be so decisive it would end the war. He had faced many Union generals and he had defeated all of them. But Lee had never faced anyone like Grant before. So Grant's main goal was not Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. It was to destroy Lee's army. And he was willing to use everything he had in lives and materials to do so. When these two finally met, the bloodiest weeks of the war began. This is the story of the Battle of the Wilderness. So Grant and Lee's forces first clashed in an area of dense woods called the Wilderness. For 2 days, the army struggled among a tangle of trees they could barely see through. The fighting was bloody and chaotic. Lee was almost captured, but Longstreet arrived with reinforcements just in time to save him. Bushfires raged through the forest, burning 200 men alive. At the beginning of the third day, Grant decided to disengage and press on. Now, he did not retreat, he just disengaged and then started to press further south, forcing Lee to chase him. So, we will look at stats for this one just to give us a feel for things. All of these battles are going to take place in Virginia. The Union commander is going to be Grant, the Confederate commander is going to be Lee. This one happened in May over 2 days. Now, look at the casualty count. The Union lost 18,400 men. Confederates lost 11,400 in just 2 days. All I'm really going to say is that every time these two generals met, there was going to be a lot of bloodshed. So there was no clear winner here because even though Grant disengaged, he did not retreat, and that is what is significant about this is that he did not retreat. So they meet again because Lee has to chase after him at a place called Spotsylvania Courthouse. So this is a nasty one. The two sides entrenched and then just began viciously slaughtering one another. The soldiers struggled to fight on ground that was slippery with both mud and blood. Oftentimes the fighting was reduced to hand-to-hand combat. The firepower seen here completely destroyed the landscape, like trees were literally chopped down by just bullets. And after neither side gained an upper hand, Grant once again disengaged and continued south. Just like here at the casualty count, we see that the high casualties continue. Once again, there was no winner. Significance, Grant still didn't retreat, still kept pressing south. He was definitely different than any other general Lee had ever faced, and Lee was in trouble because he had lost 23% of his army, which he could not afford to do at this point in the war. But on the other side of that, Grant had lost 36,000 men in just 2 weeks. So it was clear that Grant was willing to use the large army he had, but that could have some pretty devastating consequences. However, Grant said, I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer, and he had Lincoln's support because he was still pushing further south than any Union general had before him. So the two meet again at a place called Cold Harbor. The Confederate Army once again entrenched themselves, and the Union aggressively tried to break their line, which resulted in massive casualties for the Union. Eventually, the battle dissolved into fierce sharpshooting. Once it became clear that the Union would be unable to break the line, Grant pushed on to James River. Look at the casualties here. The Union lost 12,738 men, the Confederates only 5,287. So this time it was a clear win for the Confederates. And if you do want to pause the video and check out that quote from Grant, you can see that he actually really regretted this battle. So the significance, Grant actually earns the nickname the Butcher by the Northern press because he's losing so many men, and he's had a few times he's broken down and cried because he's losing so many men, but he doesn't know what else to do. And then this is Lee's most decisive victory against Grant. So next time they meet is Petersburg. He had to defend Petersburg, Lee did, because it was a vital railroad center for the Confederacy, and it was the last city keeping the Union from Richmond. Once both armies arrived, 9 months of trench warfare followed, resulting in devastating losses. Now, eventually, Lee's army starts to desert. He has no supplies left, so he was forced to retreat, and Grant took Petersburg and then Richmond. So Grant finally did what every Union general had tried to do before him, and he took Richmond. Eventually, Lincoln is going to come and tour Richmond, and he said, "It seems to me that I have been dreaming a horrid nightmare for 4 years, and now the nightmare is over, because once Richmond falls, it's kind of only a matter of time." Now, Lee attempted to retreat to the west to meet up with the remaining Confederate army, but a Union cavalry cut off his retreat. When the Confederates were engaged in battle, the rest of Grant's army caught up and surrounded Lee's army. Lee didn't want to surrender, but then Grant sent Lee a letter that read, "The results of last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance." At that point, Lee kind of realizes that he has no other choice and he's going to have to surrender. Grant is just relieved that the bloodshed will finally stop, and he actually does something very surprising. He allows Lee to pick the place where the surrender will happen. So Lee does. Lee actually arrives there first. He's in his best uniform. It just looks like the picture perfect general. And then Grant rolls up and he is in this mud splattered uniform, just like the complete opposite. Whatever, the two go and they shake hands, and then they sit down, and Grant actually asks Lee, "Do you remember me?" Because the two had fought together in the Mexican-American War. And Lee responds, "Yes, I do," and they spend some time reminiscing. And that kind of goes to show how this war was so terrible because it literally turned people who had been in the same army against each other. Now, eventually, Lee asks for Grant's terms of surrender, so Grant writes them down and then gives them to Lee to read over, and this is what they said. So these were Grant's terms. Officers got to keep their small firearms and their horses. Soldiers had to immediately return home, but they would be undisturbed on their way. Soldiers had to swear to never take up arms against the United States. Lee and his men would not be tried for treason. After learning that Lee's men were starving, Grant gave them enough food to get home. Now, if those sound like generous terms, that's because they were. Grant was incredibly generous for someone whose name was Unconditional Surrender Grant. Well, his nickname, anyway. Now, Lee was really surprised, but he was definitely grateful. I think Grant's actions here are really commendable because he knew that there was a long road towards healing and forgiveness for these two sides, and he wanted to give us the best start that he could. So Lee was grateful, and as Lee was leaving, some Union people started to celebrate, but Grant shut that down pretty quickly and kind of said, those are Americans, those are our countrymen now, we're not going to celebrate their defeat. And so with that, Lee surrendering, the war is basically over at this point. Other Confederate generals will follow, and the deadliest conflict in American history comes to a close. So just to go over the cost of the war, 620,000 soldiers lost their lives during this. The war cost billions of dollars. The South was destroyed, their land and their economy, but the Union was saved and the country was brought back together. The federal government was strengthened, and then most importantly, millions of African Americans were freed from slavery.
But anyway, you made it through the Civil War. Congratulations. We're not quite done talking about death in my class, though, if you're curious. Next week, we are going to be reading a few chapters from this book, Chasing Lincoln's Killer. It's really good, so you're not going to want to miss that. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe this video. I'm kidding. You don't have to do that. Good luck on your little quiz today, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.